All right, welcome to Hoops Tonight, presented by FanDuel here at The Volume. I'm Jason Timpf. Happy Tuesday, everybody. I hope you're all having a great start to your week. The playoffs have officially started, or I guess the play-in tournament, which is basically the playoffs. This is going to be one of the most interesting playoff runs of our lifetimes, I think. There's just an unbelievably loaded field with a ton of talent. I personally can't wait. We are going to break down that Cavs-Nets game, which went about exactly as I expected. And then we're going to spend the second half of the show focusing on a breakdown of what I think is going to be the most interesting series in the first round, which is Brooklyn versus Boston, as a result of tonight's play-in game. I'm not going to tell you guys who I'm picking until the end of the video, but I do think that series is going 7 games. That's how close those teams are. We're going to get into the weeds of what that series is going to look like. And then for those of you guys listening on the podcast, I'm going to tack on a couple of breakdowns I did earlier having to do with the Bucks-Bulls series and the Sixers-Raptors series. I made predictions for both of those series. Stick around to the end, and you guys will hear those as well. So let's get into this game tonight between the Cavs and the Nets. So in my play-in breakdown, my preview that I did, I picked Brooklyn, which is to be expected. They're the better team. But the big reason why I picked Brooklyn is because of the fact that Brooklyn's perimeter initiators are so much better than Cleveland's, which goes without saying. However, Cleveland lost their biggest advantage in that matchup. With Jared Allen on the floor, the front court of the Cavaliers would be so imposing as to allow the Cavs some margin for error with their stars. Because obviously Darius Garland and Caris LeVert can't go punch for punch with Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant. That's an absurd thing to expect to happen. So you have to have advantages elsewhere on the floor in order to make up for that. I talk about this a lot in my breakdown of the Bucks-Bulls series, which you guys will hear later. So if I'm trying to outplay Giannis with DeMar DeRozan, that's not going to work. But the Bucks are really bad at guarding the three-point line. So if you're a good three-point shooting team that generates a ton of three-point shots, you might be able to make up some of that gap. Problem is, the Bulls don't generate any three-point shots. They literally generate the fewest three-point shots per game in the entire NBA. So their ability to attack the Bucks' greatest weakness is not there. And so it's going to become a battle of the stars, and the Bucks just have better stars. And that's what happened to the Cavs tonight. Losing Jared Allen, they lost their interior advantage, which is something that they would have been able to use in that type of game to try to make up for some of that talent disparity, and they didn't have that. So it was going to come down to Caris LeVert and Darius Garland trying to go punch for punch with Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant. And that went about exactly as you expected. It was 40-20 after the first quarter. In that first quarter, KD and Kyrie combined for 19 points and 10 assists. Caris LeVert and Darius Garland only managed 10 points and 2 assists. And they looked kind of out of sorts, forcing things. Both of those guys seemed intent to just drive into Brooklyn's rim protection. Brooklyn, we're going to get into their defense here in a little bit when we're talking about the Celtics series, but Brooklyn has a lot of interior rim protection. Andre Drummond's a good rim protector. Nick Claxton's a good rim protector. And Kevin Durant, who you saw hit the gas on the defensive end tonight, also, when he's dialed in, is a very, very effective rim protector. So when you are playing a team like that has guys camping around the rim, you can't drive into them and try to finish. That's playing directly into their strengths. You have to pass out of that and try to get open shots away from the rim, or stop short and go to your floater, or your pull-up 15-footer, your pull-up 10-footer, anything other than driving right into the super tall guy that's going to block your shot, or you're going to have to distort your shot so much that there's almost no chance of it going in. And so that went about exactly as I expected. Now, over the course of the game, Brooklyn let up a little bit, and the Cavs got back into it. But then here we are, Cavs back within 6, late in the fourth quarter. KD goes down and makes a jump shot of what his patented one-dribble pull-up to the right. Here comes Caris LeVert, works into the lane, drives into a bunch of traffic, and trips and falls. He ends up kicking it out to Evan Mobley, and it gets worked around. But your perimeter initiator tripped and fell in the lane. They go down the other way. Kevin Durant makes another 2-dribble pull-up going along the right side. And here comes Darius Garland, gets into the lane, but he panics because here comes a rim protector, and he throws up a janky left-handed layup and shoots it all the way over the rim. So even when things got close at the end of the game, it came down to, we have Kevin Durant, you have Caris LeVert and Darius Garland, I like our chances. And that's how it went. And so in this particular matchup, there was just too much star power for the Cavs to be able to overcome. That's why it went the way that it went. So let's get into this series between the Nets and the Celtics, which I think is going to be an incredibly interesting matchup. So we're going to break this into 3 sections. We're going to take a look at what the series looks like with the Nets on offense. Then we'll look at it with the Celtics on offense. And then I want to look at the Tatum versus Durant matchup, which is how the public is going to view it, although basketball is always a whole lot more complicated than that. So let's start with the Nets on offense. First of all, the Nets have a 122.8 offensive rating with KD and Kyrie on the floor, which is absolutely amazing. The Celtics, with Marcus Smart, Al Horford, Jason Tatum, and Jaylen Brown on the floor, had to take Robert Williams out of that, obviously, because he's hurt. But with those four guys on the floor, they have a defensive rating of 98.8, which is absolutely amazing. So this is the side of the floor where you're going to have one of the best offenses that you could possibly have in a playoff series versus one of the best defenses that you can possibly have in a playoff series. The other thing that's going to be really interesting is I expect the Celtics to switch everything, which is what they've been doing all season. But with KD and Kyrie in particular, it's going to test Boston's willingness to avoid double teaming. This is something that I talked about all season. There's switching defenses all over the league, but there's different variations of it. You have teams like Boston that don't send a ton of help and leave guys on an island and hope to stagnate you. Then you have teams like Dallas that send a ton of help and a ton of the Toronto's another team like this. Ton of help, ton of doubling, tons of stunting, lots of gimmicky stuff. And there usually is a lot of opportunity to swing the ball around the perimeter to try to get open shots on the back line. But when you're playing Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, I'm not sure you can get away with staying in single coverage. You're probably going to have to start sending multiple bodies, especially on screen and roll actions, to both of those guys. This is where the Rob Williams loss can be really concerning because it's the concept of backline help. So when you send two defenders to a screen and roll, let's say that Kevin Durant brings the ball up the floor and he wants to work against Marcus Smart. So you come and set a ball screen and Tatum and Smart both go with Kevin Durant. Well, chances are you're going to have someone rolling to the basket into that short roll area right around the free throw line. Probably going to be Bruce Brown or someone like that in that position. When you dump the ball there, you're playing 4-on-3 on the back end. And that's where having that backline defender, the guy that steps over from the weak side to try to disrupt that action, becomes so important. And Rob Williams has been one of the best backline defenders in the league this year. Him being out of the picture turns that into, Al Horford's going to be there a lot, but it's going to be a lot of Daniel Tice, or maybe they'll have to go small sometimes. It changes that whole dynamic on the backline. Bruce Brown played really well tonight, but he has, at stretches over the course of the season, struggled in that type of situation, catching the ball in the short roll because he doesn't have a great floater. He's a little bit undersized. He struggles around shot blocking. So it's an interesting dynamic there, how the Celtics are going to manage when they decide to double team and send help at Kyrie and KD. And when they do, will they have the athleticism on the back line to be able to compensate for that? This is where the question becomes, where do you go? This year, for the most part, the Celtics have been going with Al Horford at the 4 and Robert Williams at the 5, especially in pivotal moments. They go huge because Al Horford and Robert Williams can both switch onto perimeter players. So with Rob Williams out of the picture, you have a decision to make. Do you prioritize a guy like Daniel Tice, another big who's nowhere near as good as Robert Williams, or do you go small and go with someone like Derek White, stick with your switching, and essentially bank on that, your athleticism and your effort to compensate with that dip in size? I would go with Derek White, but I think you're going to see a lot of both, but it'll be interesting to see as the series progresses which direction they decide to go. The question becomes, which matchups do you attack if you're Brooklyn? So when you play switching basketball, usually it's a waste of effort to attack the guy you're originally guarding. So if Kevin Durant brings the ball up the floor and he's going against Jayson Tatum, he can create shots against Jayson Tatum, but if you know the Boston Celtics are switching every screen, why would you waste your energy going against Boston's best perimeter defender? You're better off trying to find someone else, someone you have an advantage against, whether that's Marcus Smart or someone like Derek White or someone like Daniel Tice, or if you like your chances against Al Horford. So the interesting dynamic in this series, and we're going to get to this when we get to the Celtics on offense, is which matchups are the Nets going to attack most frequently? And this is where the Rob Williams injury becomes another issue. Whatever your 30-something minutes out of Rob Williams is going to be dispersed among a mix of perimeter players like Derek White and, Peyton Pritchard, guys like that, and a big guy, someone like Daniel Tice, right? That just opens up 34 extra minutes where there's a better matchup for a guy like Kevin Durant to attack. That's an interesting wrinkle in this series. I would have picked the Celtics to win this series in 5 if Robert Williams was healthy. That's how good the Celtics were. but Robert Williams was that perfect fifth guy to put alongside Marcus Smart and Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum and Al Horford, and taking him out of that picture just decreases the Celtics' margin for error. That's why I think this series is going to be pushed longer and probably to 7 games. So Nets on offense is going to be the most interesting dynamic to this series. One of the best defenses that I've seen in recent NBA history versus one of the best offenses that I've seen in recent NBA history. Those two going against each other is going to be really interesting, and it's going to be really close and competitive. Let's move to the Celtics on offense. So this year, first of all, everybody who's been watching the Nets needs to reconsider the way that they evaluate their defense. So from the top down looking, you think, oh, the Nets are a terrible defensive team. They finished the year 20th in defensive rating. You see all these games where Charlotte comes into Brooklyn and KD and Kyrie are playing and they hang like 133 points on them and they lose, and you're like, oh, the Nets don't play any defense. They don't have a chance. Well, we need to throw that out because the reality of the situation is with Kevin Durant on the floor this season, they've actually been a pretty good defense. With KD on the floor, they have a 109.7 defensive rating. It's 114.4 with him off. And Kevin Durant's been out so long this season that 114.4 number is poisoning the overall metric for the season. So they're 20th in defense on the season, but they're actually a top 10 number with Kevin Durant on the floor. That's not a perfect logic because every team has bad lineups mixing up with their data. But the bottom line is the Nets are actually a pretty decent defense with Kevin Durant on the floor. The Celtics on that end of the floor have been good, not great. That same four-man grouping that I told you about, Marcus Smart, Al Horford, Jason Tatum, and Jaylen Brown, was scoring about 115 points per 100 possessions with that four on the floor. That's an okay number. So this side of the floor is going to be a little more interesting or a little bit different. The Nets on offense, it's an amazing offense versus an amazing defense. With the Celtics on offense, it's going to be a pretty good offense versus a pretty good defense, a totally different type of dynamic. I expect the Nets to double Tatum as the series progresses. In their last matchup, when the Celtics went into Brooklyn and won that game, they left Tatum on an island for the most part, and he killed the Nets because he was able to attack specific matchups. We were talking earlier about which matchups would Brooklyn attack? Who would Kyrie and KD attack? It's going to have to be someone like Daniel Tice in the minutes that he's on the floor, someone like Derek White, maybe Marcus Smart if you think you can shoot over the top. Those are the kinds of guys that they'll be attacking. Boston's going to have better matchups to attack. You're always going to have someone like Seth Curry on the floor. You're going to have moments where you can attack Patty Mills. Kyrie Irving, he's an okay defensive player in certain matchups, but you're going to be able to shoot over the top of him. So Boston's going to have better matchups to attack. That gives Tatum a margin for error, which we'll get into a little bit when we talk about the Tatum-Durant matchup. But I think as the series progresses, the Nets are going to end up having to send multiple bodies at Jayson Tatum, which is something that he's been seeing a ton as the season has come to an end, especially over the course of the last few months. This is where it gets interesting because the Nets have a great backline. You got Nick Claxton, you got Andre Drummond, you got Kevin Durant. We talked about that earlier, how dominant they were against the Cavs tonight. They have a ton of size right around the basket. So I expect the Nets to overplay the paint and double team Tatum. So it's going to be a lot of Tatum coming off a screen and rolls or being doubled in the open floor and guys making decisions out of the short roll, guys like Marcus Smart. This is where corner three-point shooting is going to become really, really important. The Celtics are going to get a lot of wide-open corner threes against this Nets defensive scheme this year, and the Celtics are only okay shooting out there. Derek White has been a really bad three-point shooter since he came to the Celtics, but strangely enough, he's actually okay in the corner. He's been shooting 42% from the corner since he's been a Celtic. Al Horford's right around 40%. But Marcus Smart's like 37% in the corner. Jaylen Brown is like 34% in the corner. The corner three is one of the weirdest shots in basketball for a lot of shooters. It's a shorter distance, but the optics of it are very different, and you're usually stationary, which is difficult to adjust to in the up and down flow of the game. So a big part of the series is going to be, will the Celtics be able to make corner threes when the Nets double Jayson Tatum on the perimeter and they make decisions out of the short roll and the Nets overplay the paint with their size? That's going to be an interesting aspect. Whether or not the Celtics make those threes could go a long way to determining this series. So let's look at the Tatum versus Durant matchup. Tatum has ascended in my book this season. I call him a bona fide superstar. It's hard to say where he places in the league. I'd put him with Ja Morant, Devin Booker as guys who are kind of fighting in that 9, 10, 11 range of players in the NBA. Like, firmly beneath the guys above them, but firmly above the rest. And call it like the third tier of players in the NBA. That's a compliment to Jayson Tatum. Kevin Durant's the best player in the world, in my opinion. So on the surface, you look at that like, can Jayson Tatum outplay Kevin Durant? That's a lot to ask. But this is where those matchups become such an important detail. Kevin Durant's going to be going against the best defense in basketball. And Jayson Tatum's going to be going against an okay defense. Now, if the Nets double him all series long, that takes that decision out of Jayson Tatum's hands. I trust Jayson Tatum to make the right play, to get the ball to the short roll, make the right reads, and give the Celtics a chance to make plays on the back end. But in single coverage situations, Jayson Tatum simply has a better selection of players to attack. He's going to be able to pick on Patty Mills. He's going to be able to pick on Kyrie Irving. He's going to be able to pick on Seth Curry. He's going to be able to pick on slow-footed bigs like Andre Drummond on the perimeter if he gets a chance. Durant's going to have he's going to have greater defensive players that he has to choose from who he's going to attack. You saw that specifically take place the last time the Celtics played the Nets and beat them up in Barclays Center. At the end of the game, Kevin Durant was coming down the floor, shooting pull-up jump shots over Jayson Tatum and Robert Williams and Al Horford, and he was still making some shots, but they were tougher shots. And meanwhile, Jayson Tatum was getting down the floor and attacking Seth Curry out of the high post and getting to his jump shot and knocking stuff down. The Nets ended up having to double team him in the open floor when he would get Seth Curry in those isolation situations, and they were getting wide open looks out of it. So, again, Durant's the better player. Tatum has an advantage. He has more margin for error because his defense is better. And Kevin Durant doesn't have the same thing behind him. So that'll be the interesting dynamic. This is why I don't like it when people say, like, if Boston wins a series, I wouldn't say Tatum beat Durant. Tatum's better than Durant. No. It's a team sport. But I think Durant's a significantly better player. Tatum has more margin for error. That gives him an opportunity to win. So this is as close to a 50-50 series as I could possibly imagine. Home court plays a big role. Boston's a really, really difficult place to play. But Kevin Durant is impervious to that sort of thing, as you've seen so many times over the years, including his Game 5 and Game 7 in Milwaukee last year. In a series this close, that is split by the thinnest of margins, I have to go to the better player. So I'm picking Kevin Durant and the Nets to beat the Celtics in 7 games, based purely on the fact that Kevin Durant's the best player in the series. Everything else to me is so split evenly down the middle. Both teams have advantages. Both teams, I think, will have moments in the series where it feels like they're in control. Home court will play a role. I think Kevin Durant overcomes that. Nets in 7. All right, guys, that's all I have for tonight. As always, I appreciate your support, and I'll see you guys in a couple of days.